Chapter 2, Father Figure, 2019. Scene 4, Philip. The tall man cursed when Philip bumped his shoulder. Raising a hand to show regret, Philip glanced at the stocky chest, black shoes, and brown shorts. It was a warm August evening, and a larger-than-usual crush of people had swarmed 3rd Avenue. When he turned around, Philip almost slammed into a woman waiting at the curb. The idea of being alone with Ellie's parents was a hell of a distraction. Earlier that day, Philip asked, "Where are you going to be?" "My therapist," Ellie said. "I have an appointment at 6. "Where's the office I can—" "No," she insisted. "Go straight to the house. I'll meet you there." That was the other reason Philip was frazzled. He was focused, confident, and optimistic when he and Ellie were together. Gran made him feel special, but this girl he'd been dating since the 10th grade made him feel strong. Doesn't she need me? Philip wondered. What if she has one of those crazy fits? He pivoted to the right to cross the street, but the whir of a motorized drivetrain brought him up short. "It's a fucking bike lane, moron!" The cyclist was halfway down the block before Philip realized how close he'd come to being hit. By this time tomorrow, he and Ellie would be at Harvard. The drive to the campus was 4 hours, but Philip had no idea what time they were leaving. His bags were already packed and scheduled for pickup early tomorrow morning. Ellie lived on 79th between Madison and 5th. The Harrington brood occupied a mansion in Chelsea, but Philip preferred the Upper East Side. There weren't as many dysfunctional families. Philip's friends were mutually unhappy kids whose parents belonged to a tight-knit community of Wall Street professionals, lawyers, and politicians. Since Ellie's life was full of love and support, these jaded teens would have been jealous were it not for her emotional challenges. When he reached Madison, Philip glanced both ways before crossing the street. The Petty Peace House had the imposing look of an official building, like the School of Practical Philosophy and Meditation on the corner. The threshold was ornate, and the sandstone facade was 4 stories high. Philip let the wrought iron gate close with a clang, then pushed the bell with a trembling finger. Not for the first time, he thought it was crazy that their fathers were both hedge fund managers. James Harrington had the manner of a snake, while David evinced the easygoing air of a lovable coach. Nevertheless, the words shot out of Philip's mouth as if the Grim Reaper had opened the door. "Ellie told me to come before dinner," Philip said. "I hope that's all right." David smiled. "It's more than all right." He reached out and placed his hand on Philip's shoulder. "You know you're always welcome here." That was not, in fact, something Philip took for granted. Until this moment, he hadn't been sure why Ellie's parents allowed them to spend so much time alone. The kind words and the familiarity of the foyer welcomed Philip into the house like a giant hug. God, he thought, as he crossed the threshold, what I wouldn't give to have a family like this. The antique hall stand, the elegant sconces, and the polished wood floor had an old-world charm that Philip had come to love. When they reached the sitting room, David turned and said, "I'm going to level with you, Philip. We arranged for things to be this way." Ann Pettypiece was already perched on the sofa. She was a short, round woman with a moon face. Philip's heart began to pound when she patted the cushion, indicating that he should sit beside her. He was a C student when he entered Dalton, but spending time with Ellie's family had changed his life. By graduation day in May, he had 2 years of A's under his belt. Philip assumed they wanted to talk about the drive tomorrow and was beaming like a little kid when Anne reached over, rubbed his arm, and said, "All of Ellie's friends are going to other schools, so we thought it would be prudent to—" "Whatever you do," David cut in, "don't urge Ellie to eat." As he took the wing-back leather armchair beside the fireplace, Anne seemed to mistake Philip's disappointment for shock. "This is about her therapy," she added quickly. "The best way to support Ellie is sort of counterintuitive." David leaned forward. "There are 4 rules." He raised an index finger. "That was rule number 1. You're going to want to, but don't ever try to make her eat." Anne lowered her arm and folded her hands over her lap. "It's good to show how much you care." "That's rule number 2, David said. "Also, don't let her behavior control you. That's rule number 3. "Feeling guilty is bad," Anne said with an encouraging smile. "If you see she's not eating, Don't blame yourself. Having adjusted to the reality that this wasn't the conversation he wanted, Philip found his voice. What's rule number 4? The big picture, David said. This isn't about how you feel, it's about what works. When Anne said, "We trust you, Philip, to look out for Ellie," it was as if she'd revealed that he was a prince after being treated like a pauper all his life. His parents never entrusted him with anything, probably because they assumed he was empty and sadistic like them. Hearing Anne's words, Philip straightened his back and savored the unfamiliar taste of self-respect. During the last 2 years, though, he'd probably violated at least one of the 4 rules. He knew there was a problem, but had selfishly focused on making sure she didn't pull away whenever the issue of food came up. Never again, Philip thought. As if reading his mind, Anne said, "Don't worry about the past. Things have gotten so much better since you started dating." There was the jingle of keys, followed by the hesitant creak of the front door. Ellie's footsteps were loud, considering she only weighed 100 pounds. Later at dinner, Philip glanced across the table and spied in Ellie a hint of how Anne must have looked as a teenager. Bright green eyes, reddish-brown hair, rosy cheeks. Despite Anne's figure, it wasn't realistic to assume that Ellie, as a mom, would be anything other than petite. Philip savored the memory of the night they lost their virginity together as he slipped a spoonful of lobster bisque into his mouth. David and Anne never worried about how late he stayed in the house, but he'd made sure to be gone before dawn the next morning. Do they talk about everything? He wondered, seeing that Ellie and her parents had clearly agreed that he needed to be briefed on her eating disorder. His attention was brought back to the present when David said something that made Ellie and her mom laugh. Philip enjoyed their banter, even when they talked about relatives he'd never met. As he tried to re-engage with the conversation, his warm feeling disappeared when David glanced at him and said, "What time is your family leaving for the campus?" Family, Philip thought. What family? The question was like a dagger through the heart. How could they believe his parents gave a shit? Forcing confidence into his voice, Philip lied. 9 o'clock. Anne reached over and stroked Ellie's arm. "Isn't that late?" She glanced at David. "They won't arrive until sometime after noon." Apparently, there was an alternate universe in which Ellie's family assumed he lived, but even there, Philip was certain his parents would never drive to the campus. "Teterboro," he said. "Dad chartered a flight." "Ah," David smiled and glanced back at Anne. "Of course he did." The awkwardness of the moment notwithstanding, Philip had to concede the power of the Harrington reputation. The cars, the mansion, the extravagant trips. How could anyone know that he and his brother were little more than well-dressed mannequins as far as their parents were concerned? Philip and Ellie usually went back to her room after dinner, but he used the trip as an excuse to cut out early. She was his girlfriend, not his sister, but Philip felt abandoned as he closed the wrought iron gate and shoved both hands into his pockets. The 6 was the fastest way to Chelsea, but instead of turning east toward Lexington, Philip let out a sigh and wandered in the direction of Central Park. He hadn't been home since early that morning and wasn't eager to go back now. The day had been hot, but the night was cool. Philip looked both ways before crossing Fifth Avenue. Near the entrance to the path that wound around the Glade Arch, a group of teenagers lounged under a tree. As Philip strode past a line of giant oaks, moonlight flickered through their bulbous canopies. Up ahead, a little girl darted off the path and onto the grass. Shrieking with laughter, she ran around in circles to evade her parents. Like a shaman in the grip of a vision, Philip froze and stared at the future he so desperately wanted. A wife, kids, kind in-laws. No amount of financial success will matter without Ellie. Marriage was the only realistic path to being accepted into a family, and, as a lonely kid, Philip had spent years looking forward to becoming an adult. He shut his eyes and imagined walking a dog in the morning, going to work, and returning to a noisy home at the end of the day. It was a dream that he would never admit to his friends, a secret desire that he barely admitted to himself. Now that he thought about it, he wanted his children to spend a lot of time with their grandparents, so he even fantasized about buying a house on the Upper East Side. Next to David and Anne, Philip mused. Given a network he planned to build over the next 4 years, He intended to go into business without having to ask James Harrington for anything. Breathing deeply, he listened to the breeze rustling through the park. It was as if he'd stepped into the future and was standing down the street from the home in which he and Ellie were raising a warren of kids. Philip opened his eyes just as the girl was caught by her father, who grabbed her by the waist and hoisted her over his head. She waved when he strode past the young family, then leaned forward and wrapped her arms around her dad's neck. The world seemed brighter as Philip maneuvered through New Yorkers, enjoying an after-dinner stroll. Down in the tunnel at 77th Street, a train screeched to a halt as he darted toward the station. Philip took the stairs 2 at a time, swiped his card, and jumped on just before the doors closed. 10 minutes later, he emerged among the bustle of 23rd and Park. Setting his jaw like a man on a mission, he marched along the avenue of skyscrapers. The Harrington mansion was on a quiet tree-lined street 3 blocks south and 4 blocks west. It stood out like a missile launcher in the middle of a garden. Its blackened steel facade was hailed as an innovation, but Philip knew his father meant it as a middle finger to their neighbors. The butler looked up in alarm when Philip burst into his office. With the understanding that he didn't want to overburden Ellie's parents, Walter had arranged for his bags to be shipped. His face became a simulacrum of pity as Philip explained the need to change the plan. "My son could use a bit of spending money," Walter said. "Would you like him to join you?" When Philip raised a hand to object, Walter added quickly, "The bags will be in the lobby by the time you get there, but that also means they'll be unattended until your registration is complete." This isn't about the money, Philip thought. It's about my misread of Ellie's family. This had been the way of things all his life. Birthday gifts came every year, along with the lie that his parents had remembered the date. Walter filled the void of emotional neglect almost as if it were part of his job. Ironically, his son evinced the opposite of civility and only seemed willing to earn spending money on holidays when the staff was unable to handle the sudden surge of guests. He's loyal to his father, though, Philip thought, and traveling with an acquaintance is better than traveling alone. He nodded his thanks, went to bed, and woke to the certainty that Walter and Arnold were busy taking care of everything he needed for the trip. As he threw off the sheets and rose to his feet, Philip thought about the pact he'd made with his friends. Cambridge, they agreed, was their chance to turn a corner. By going away, they were burying 19 years of bad memories. After a shit, shower, and shave, Philip glanced around the room, wondering whether he would even bother returning to the house for Thanksgiving. This section of the mansion was on the 3rd floor and included a sitting area between 2 master suites. Philip expected to hear snores when he opened the door, but his brother's bedroom was suspiciously quiet. Idly, he wondered, where the fuck is that asshole? He wasn't hungry, so he bypassed the 1st floor and took the elevator down to the garage. To his surprise, the butler had chosen the limo. Walter was behind the wheel, while Arnold stood on the passenger side, staring down at his phone. The former was in uniform because it was a regular workday, while Arnold's sulky demeanor belied the casualness of his blue jeans, tennis shoes, and Yankees cap. Being about the same age, the teens could have been mistaken for friends, but over the years, Philip had formed the sneaky suspicion that Arnold didn't like him very much. The limo, however, was a touching thought, which meant it had to be Walter's idea. Frowning, Philip considered how the extensive seating area would only make it hard to ignore the fact that he was alone. In an attempt to get Walter's attention, Philip was leaning forward and waving at the windshield when, over his shoulder, the elevator opened and released the pungent odor of cigars. The brief image of his father shot by in a flash before he slithered through the limo's passenger side door. "Where the fuck do you think you're going?" Philip wanted to shout, but the lack of surprise on Arnold's face suggested this had all been prearranged. Stepping gingerly forward, Philip parted his hands as if to say, "What the hell, man?" Despite the entreaty, All he got in response from the butler's son was a stoic expression that made it clear that Arnold didn't give a shit. Fine, Philip thought, lowering himself into the limo. He had to take the seat facing the front of the car because his father had sprawled across the other and was already snoring. Philip hated the way he smelled, so when Arnold closed the door, he lowered the window to about level with his nose. He anticipated a stop somewhere in Manhattan, but Walter pulled out of the garage and headed straight to the Hudson. Traffic was heavy until they squeezed out of the western end of the turnpike. The words, "The man you want to see is Talbot," caused Philip to jerk back in his seat. James Harrington was upright and smoothing his hair down with his hand when Philip turned away from the window. "The room key," Philip's father said. "Get that from him." From the front seat, Arnold twisted around and said, "Yes, sir." 10 minutes later, Philip's eyes went wide as they pulled onto the tarmac at Teterboro. "Are we all going to Cambridge?" he wondered. As the question exploded like a bomb in his mind, Philip followed his father out of the car. His mouth agape, he stared up at the gangplank as the stranger disappeared through the Gulfstream 4's arched door. Philip's head swiveled around like a lost child, hoping to get the answer from Walter, but his confusion gave way to envy when his eyes settled on the sight of the butler hugging his son.